Hello and welcome to a illustrated lecture on cinematography. And some of this stuff you're probably at least a little familiar with from some of the earlier ed puzzles in your readings, but I want to go over them quickly. And we've got quite a menu, as you can see. So aspect ratio, film stock and grain, camera distance, camera angle, internal framing, camera movement, and finally lenses. So let's get started with aspect ratio. And basically, aspect ratio refers to the relative dimensions of the frame, the screen image. I know this sounds complicated, but it's really quite simple. It's described as a numerical value, and the 1 is always consistently the height, where the other number, 133 or whatever it might be, 180, 235, refers to the width. So it probably would be easier to see this as an illustration. So here we have a list and some dark images which correspond to the numerical value of the traditional aspect ratios currently being used. And so 133:1 was popular in Hollywood through the 1950s, beginning at about 1924. If you look at an old TV set, you'll notice that the screen size pretty much is a mirror of this aspect ratio, and that was because they were hoping when TV came into being that they would be able to use films on TV. The tendency has been to get wider and wider, although the jump happened really quite quickly in the early 1950s with the 235:1 aspect ratio. And that was being used for biblical epics and stereophonic sound movies that were meant to get people out of their homes and back into the theaters at a time when people were staying home more often because of television. The aspect ratio in the center is one that is pretty much equivalent to current televisions, the 6:9 aspect ratio. So about getting close to about twice as wide, 1.85, as it is high, 1. So again, 1 is consistently the height, and then the other number is how large relative to the 1 the size is. And of course, that'll change things like balance and so on. So what we have here, again, is using a film that was initially shot, at least in part of it was shot in IMAX in 235:1, which you can see on the bottom, The Dark Knight, and how if you don't keep your settings to correspond to the original aspect ratio, showing that image on a 180 or 6:9 television set would have you losing information on both sides. And in the old days, it was really bad. You'd lose about 1.5 the original image. And so they would compensate for that with a process known as letterboxing, where they'd have the full image, 235:1, inside of a 133:1 image. And so you'd have these black bars at the top and the bottom of the screen, and the image itself was relatively small. So, but the main interest here is in composition and in terms of enveloping the spectator in spectacle. And so again, with movies that involve a lot of action and so on, you would use the 235:1. Superhero films, for example, like The Dark Knight, would do that. Drama is now 178:1, and the 133:1, more quirky films. So here, now moving on to film stock, the stuff on which films used to be made. Now more and more it's on digital equipment. And film stock basically can be, again, described by all you math people are probably freaking out. But this has nothing to do with math. It's simply the size of the frame. So film stock is again described in a numerical value. And basically, it's the width of the film in millimeters. And so the standard width in Hollywood films, and actually internationally, was 35 millimeter. In fact, if you're taking a photography class now that uses a darkroom and you're shooting on actual film, you'll be using 35 millimeter still, because it really does have a nice resolution. A lot of detail is available. The other film stock sizes, for example, 16 millimeter, was used more for documentary films, for experimental films. It was far less expensive than 35 millimeter. But as you can see, the frame size is really, even though it's half the length of 35 millimeter, half the width of 35 millimeter, you could easily fit 4 16 millimeter images within a 35 millimeter image, and the same goes for 8 millimeter. You could fit about 4 images into a 16 millimeter, and so on. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because of resolution and grain. And so it's kind of like going, in the case of 35 to 16, from 4K, where detail is really exquisite, to 1K, where you begin to lose quite a bit of visual information. And so 35 millimeter was a standard, but there were other film stocks as well. And here's a big bunch of them. So basically, as you can see, most films are screened vertically. So sprocket holes are on the side, sometimes on both sides. When you start moving into 16 millimeter, you can see the image more clearly. And when you move to 35 millimeter on the left side center, you have sprocket holes on both sides. You have a soundtrack running down the side and the image itself. And so 70 millimeter film then on the bottom left was developed to, again, add more resolution, to add more detail. And so you couldn't quite fit 4 35 millimeter images onto a 70 millimeter film, but the resolution was really great, particularly for widescreen films. I won't get into the details of why. It gets kind of complicated using special lenses to squeeze a widescreen image onto a regular 35 millimeter frame and using another lens to squeeze it back. So various techniques were used, including wider film and bigger film. So the biggest film that was used, and still is actually on occasion, is 70 millimeter IMAX, and you can see that in the center left. And so this film is basically 70 millimeter film, but you'll notice that the sprocket holes are on the top and on the bottom. So you're able to make much greater use of screen size. It's a much squarer image than the 70 millimeter that we have here. And its resolution is really quite spectacular. As you'll see later, the cameras are monstrous, even today with digital IMAX, but the resolution is spectacular, which is why people like Christopher Nolan will want to shoot at least part of his film in 70 millimeter. So very few films are shot entirely in 70 millimeter. Only the action moments typically are. Another function aside from resolution that what bigger and different film stocks add to the image is what's called grain. And here you can see an image that's actually from a computer game that's been split in half. And on the left-hand side, you can see that there's no film grain at all. And of course there wouldn't be, because film wasn't used. That's the thing about digital cinematography, is that there is no grain. And so sometimes, as in the case on the right, grain will be added to give it a more film-like look. It's a process that's done in post-production, and it can look pretty cheesy if it's done poorly. But what it does is it adds some texture to the image that's missing in the image on the left. And so I remember when The Hobbit first came out, it was shot in 70 millimeter. 4K, and it was shot digitally, so there was no grain at all. And people complained that it looked like a television soap opera. In fact, that term, soap opera effect, has been used to describe films that you can calibrate your TV to get that effect, and usually that's the default mode, so everything looks like a soap opera, which sucks. And so instead, you want to have that grain, which gives it a real film look. So you can, for example, notice the grain here. This is 16 millimeter film, and you're shooting in low light conditions, which is going to make the grain more predominant. But you can see the natural grain that's a function of the emulsion on the film and the processing of the film. And so real film will, in fact, have grain. Usually it won't be this noticeable, but nighttime scenes will tend to make it noticeable. Again, digital doesn't have this process, this effect, but it does have other effects, other types of digital noise. Moving on, I want to talk about some things that you can quickly put into your toolbox when analyzing the image. And the first thing I want to talk about is camera distance. And this is relatively simple. How close to the subject is the camera? And so as you can see, it's expressed usually in shorthand. So XLS for extreme long shot, LS for long shot, MLS for medium long shot, medium shot. And this shot is very typical. Actually, these center three shots are very classical to shoot film scenes. You get closer to a character or farther away. So a medium shot moving to a close-up, to a extreme close-up on the far hand right. And so it's simply a function of how close you are to the camera. And the idea here is that the closer you get to a subject, the more emotionally close you get to the subject. And so Charlie Chaplin said tragedy is in close-up, comedy in long shot. And so this is an image from the Three Stooges where Moe on the left is eye-poking Curly. I'm sorry, Moe on the right is eye-poking Curly on the left. And we laugh at this. Ha ha ha, it's funny. And so if we were to get that, though, in extreme close-up, so imagine a finger kind of coming into this eye, it would be like a horror film, right? It would be something that we probably wouldn't laugh at, something we would expect to see in a movie like Saw, perhaps, but not certainly in the Three Stooges, where it would be hideous. An eye coming in and poking that would be horrific. So, again, using close-ups, like here again with The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan, here using an extreme close-up, which is a little bit off-putting sometimes. In one of our Ed puzzles from last time, we had an image from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the gunfight, and how we move to these extreme close-ups. So it's a way to draw our attention to the words that are going to be spoken in this film at this moment, which you can see reproduced at the bottom of this frame, which is Rosebud, which is the MacGuffin to this film and gets the whole story kind of started. So again, put that in your toolbox for how close to the subject are we. If we see a baby crying in close-up, we're going to be crying ourselves. If we see a baby crying in an extreme long shot, we're going to be like, okay, whatever. It won't affect us nearly as much. So how close we get, within reason, like this is too close, will bring us closer emotionally to the subject. So that's camera distance. Let's talk about angle for a moment. And basically, camera angle describes where the camera is relative to the subject in terms of just that, the angle. And so most films are shot within this middle range. So a high angle being not very high, a eye level or neutral angle being the dominant form of shooting films, and then a low angle. And so the rule of thumb here is that, of course, cinematic invisibility is to keep things at an eye level. or slightly low or slightly high level. And when we start getting low, the idea is that the character begins to have more power. Part of that has to do with that idea of dominant lines. And so we have these lines that are created on the left and right by this character. So she's a pretty powerful character looming over us, looking at us, in fact, and so giving her a sense of power, where we see that again here as well with The Dark Knight. Low angle, and it's kind of this interestingly crazed image. The background is out of focus, and it's a kind of interesting combination of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal lines, which suggests, as you know, instability, and the character is basically off-center. So, again, suggesting instability through mild compositional stress. Bird's eye view is when you go completely over the top, literally. So you've got the camera and you're looking straight down at the subject. I'm going to take a moment to show you this scene from Psycho, and I'll talk over it so we can just see how Hitchcock put this together. So here we go, and as you can see, we've got these diagonal lines created by the stair. The film was shot in black and white. It's about a 1:80 aspect ratio, and the character recedes, becoming smaller in the frame as he moves back. And so we've got this kind of continuity of movement. The character is moving from left to right in the last shot. He's moving closer to this door, still, again, getting smaller. And possibly it could be argued entrapped more. So here he is, he's opening the door, trying to find Mrs. Bates, and looking at the mise-en-scène, which is really quite interesting. You could spend some time taking a look at this shot yourself on YouTube. And it does tell us about the characters. So Arbogast, from a slightly high angle, is going to check up stairs as Cupid points his arrow at him a bit threateningly, and we get high as the camera moves with him. So this is a kind of a complicated camera rig, and we get this introduction of suspense. Again, a high angle on the door looking down, but it catches this interesting light effect, a diagonal line, and here we go with the murder. Whoa! And actually, Martin Balsam, the actor, was put on a rig there to let him appear to be falling down the stairs. But using that bird's eye view is really kind of a wonderful way to keep the identity of the killer from us, even though we suspect we know who it is. So when you're talking about a shot like this, and of course now we're deprived of movement, but when you're talking about a shot like this, you do want to bring things in like camera distance, which is medium. You want to bring in things like color, possibly, which is here black and white, so completely desaturated. Looking too at the composition in terms of the rule of thirds, which of course is going to be subject to change as the characters move, but these interesting lines created by the banister and by the staircase and by the hallway and so forth. But of course, most important is the camera angle, where we're looking directly down almost on these characters. And so some of the information, for example, the facial features of the killer, are kept from us, even though, as I said, we think we know who did it. It's Mom. So, also, just quickly, of course, another aspect here is that when we look down at characters, we tend to get a sense of the characters being helpless, which is definitely the case with the character on the left. the Martin Balsam character. So we're looking down upon these characters. The character on the right, of course, has got a knife, and it's displayed predominantly, so that gives that character a little bit of power, given that the other character is holding in his hand only a hat. So we may or may not get into a more elaborate analysis of Psycho. My guess is not, but there is plenty of interesting stuff in this film to look at. So moving on, this is a shot, of course, and again, bringing in aspect ratio. This is a wider screen film, 235:1. Several of you probably know this as the Shawshank Redemption. And the color is really it's almost like it's tinted. It's very blue. And again, we're at a bird's eye view. We're looking down at a character. But his movement, and of course we don't see the movement, we see the result of the movement, the fact that it's raining. There's a kind of cleansing going on here. And this is a character who had just, and you can just kind of see in the background evidence of where he emerged from. He was just in the earth. He had just escaped from prison. And so this sense of freedom, the sense of space between him and the sky, the air, is kind of suggestive, not of insignificance because we're looking down at him, but rather freedom. So it's not a rule that is chiseled in stone that if the angle is high, you're going to be considering the character insignificant. If the character is farther away than Tim Robbins is here, we might think that's more likely and in dingy surroundings as opposed to in this kind of refreshing, cool rain, again, differently as well. But all things considered, when you look down at a character, you look down on a character psychologically as well. So moving on, I want to talk about the canted angle. And this is, again, we're using a low angle, but with the canted angle, what you do is you turn the camera from its tripod so that it's creating these diagonal lines. Usually these lines are horizontal and parallel to the lines at which we're used to seeing things. We're not used to seeing things tilted like this. And so, of course, what happens with the canted angle is it creates a sense of instability. Here's a shot from the film, what is it? Don't Breathe. And the camera is very obviously canted, and the lighting, again, bringing in these aspects. There's very little information here, actually, right, in terms of mise-en-scène. But the camera is really strongly canted. The backlight is the only light that's in evidence. And so the character is silhouetted and obviously, or perhaps not so obviously, in danger. But certainly surrounded in darkness. Here, moving from a low canted angle to a high canted angle. This is from the Coen brothers film, The Man with No Name, which is really a great film that was shot in color, and then they desaturated it to present it in black and white. Their idea was to create a contemporary film noir. But really, this is why black and white film is so interesting. It's so stark. The detail just seems written in light. It's just beautiful stuff. And so again, you have a canted angle. So you have these strong diagonal lines and this strong sense of backlighting. And this is a world of mystery as well. And so I strongly encourage you to take a look at some of the film noirs, or even this film, The Man Who Wasn't There, which stars Billy Bob Thornton. And it had mixed reviews, but I'm kind of fond of it. But in any case, want to move from that to internal framing. Internal framing is simply when the mise-en-scène is arranged so as to construct frames within the frame. And so we've seen that already with that shot from Don't Breathe, right, where the woman was silhouetted against the door frame. Here, from Rear Window, we have these mini screens in the film from which the character played by Jimmy Stewart, watches action in his apartment complex unfold. And so sometimes internal framing can give you a sense of being entrapped, although that's certainly not the case here. Here's Jack Nicholson breaking through the door in The Shining, which is a sequel is coming out soon. And here from Bob Le Flambeur. This is a French film directed by an American, and it's about a heist. And so an interesting kind of internal frame. They're preparing to rob a bank, and part of what they need to do is to break through this ceiling in order to create a hole for them to escape from. And so this is the moment at which that hole has been made. And so we have this frame, the circular frame within a frame. Here from The Graduate, using a character as almost a prop. Dustin Hoffman in the background, being enclosed by the legs of Mrs. Robinson, who is in fact trying to seduce him at this point and possibly entrap him. Dustin Hoffman doesn't seem particularly worried about that, although he might be and possibly should be as the film unfolds and he begins to fall in love with Mrs. Robinson's daughter, who is probably more age appropriate to the character. So this nice kind of internal frame, classic actually, from the film The Graduate. And here, from Wes Anderson's film The Grand Budapest Hotel, which uses, as you can see, a pretty square 133:1 aspect ratio for both the film and the frame. And so basically what Anderson did in this film was to shoot all of the scenes that took place in the past in this aspect ratio, and all the frames that were shot in the quote-unquote present were shot using a wide 235:1 aspect ratio. So you don't get that often in films where you change aspect ratio, but it does happen on occasion. And here, internal framing that's created from, again, the mise-en-scène. This is from a Russian director, Ivan Tarkovsky, and his second film, Ivan's Childhood. And you can see how this character, it's just almost expressionistic with the use of these jagged lines and this character being threatened. It's about this character walking through the war-torn Europe and kind of taking in the devastation, starving and moving through this landscape. It's really quite a beautiful film. Tarkovsky is an interesting director, and his work is visually quite stunning. This and his other black and white films in particular are just amazing to look at. And so, again, this is Ivan's Childhood. So if you're interested in following up on this, it's quite beautiful. Andrei Rublev is another film that he directed that's often been picked as one of the best shot films of all time. It's about a Russian religious icon painter. But moving on, we'll begin now to talk about camera movement. And I want to get through this really quickly because you'll have another video which demonstrates the use. And so I just want to show you what the equipment looks like. And so handheld camera, you can see it's not exactly handheld, it's shoulder harnessed, but it gives you a shaky look and it allows for complete mobility. This is a 16 millimeter camera, handheld, very common, very light. You can see the crank. So you'd only get about 30 seconds worth of a shot at the longest with these cameras. I used to actually teach using these cameras, filmmaking. Now, of course, we have handheld cameras that are digital, including our phones, but this is a more high-end version of the same. And on the opposite end of the spectrum is the IMAX camera on a tripod, which is really sturdy because you can see this thing is quite a beast, and it requires a lot of heavy equipment to support it even. So the tripod basically is this device that is holding the camera and allows you to pan left and right or horizontally and tilt up and down. And it also stabilizes the camera. This is a dolly, which is often put on a track, and it allows you to smoothly move the camera. This takes 3 people, believe it or not. One person to push, one person to keep the image in frame, and another to keep the image in focus. So it's an expensive proposition. This is a dolly with a combination mini crane, which will raise and lower the camera on the dolly. This is a dolly in use, and you can see the 3 people involved, as I said, in controlling it. This is a monitor that allows you to see what's being shot through the lens. And on the track as well, another dolly setup. This for a car that will be turning a corner to be done in 2 shots. This is part of a crane. You can see the crane kind of reaching out here. This is from the golden days of Hollywood, and this would use several, to put it mildly, people, sometimes as many as a dozen, to move this monstrous thing around. So they've more recently allowed for these devices called jibs, which will raise and lower the camera in a much more light fashion, doesn't require as many people. And even this, which really only needs one person to manipulate the mini jib, so to speak, which allows you, of course, you don't get the same height, right, with this as you would with a old studio crane shot. And the Steadicam, this has become increasingly important. It was invented in the 70s, and if you look at movies like, for example, The Shining, anything Martin Scorsese does, Stanley Kubrick, the Steadicam has been replacing the handheld camera because it allows you to run upstairs without shaking the camera. The camera remains smooth. So still a heavy rig, but not quite as awkward as the prototype being demonstrated here by its inventor, where you'd actually viewfind through one eye. And so they use Steadicams even in moving shots. Here a guy the camera person is dressed and harnessed into a car to follow the movement of a car that's actually following the van that the Steadicam is set in on, and even Segway Cam, which allows some portability and speed as well with the Steadicam. You'll see some really interesting uses of how complicated these shots can become as they're handed off from a drone, for example, and drone shots have become very important to an operator on the ground in one shot. Continuous shot. And this is a handheld kind of home use crane, or rather Steadicam device. So going to get just a bit into depth of field, and again you'll see more about camera movement later, but the idea here is that depth of field is how much of the image is in focus. And so that's dependent upon the lens type that's being used. And so the rule of thumb is that the shorter the lens, upper left, the more depth of field you'll have. You'll also have more distortion, as you saw in one of the videos that was on Edpuzzle. And the longer the lens, the more compressed the image will look. And the more light you'll need, and the harder it is to get depth of field because the light has to go through that large barrel. So I will leave this up for you to see how the different lenses, this is a short lens moving to a wide lens, works like a telescope really to bring you in or out of a scene. When you zoom it, if you have a zoom lens on your camera, like many of us have zoom lenses, but you can see why in here they're basically keeping the character the same size in the frame, but they're using different lenses. And so a long lens, because it tends to flatten features, tends to be more appreciated by actors because it's more flattering. But you can also see how the depth of field is really shallow. Everything is pretty much out of focus except for the subject. Whereas with a short lens, the character's features are distorted heavily, but you've got this great depth of field. Everything pretty much is in focus, and it exaggerates that depth. Here, it exaggerates, on the left, exaggerates the shallowness of the shot. And again, long lens left, so you're way far back from this check orange can, and very limited depth of field. And with the short lens, you're right on top of it, and you've got a wider depth of field, so the can remains the same. But even here, you can notice that the dents seem more exaggerated on the can on the right than they do on the left. So, again, long lens left, short lens right, and again, the impact of the lens on the human face. And so usually, directors like to keep the lens at about somewhere between 35 and 200, usually about 100, 135, somewhere in there, but less flattering, not quite so flattering, and more flattering. So you can see, again, the impact of the lens on what you see that has nothing to do with mise-en-scène. So I'm going to end it at this point and encourage you to take a look at the videos on camera movement in our last section of Edpuzzles as we move through mise-en-scène and cinematography. And I hope you're all well. Have a great rest of your day. I will see you later. Take care.